She was 5 years old, and she pointed at my forearm the way children pointed at things they recognized, without hesitation, without the social filter that adults developed to make pointing feel less direct than it was. She said, "My mom had this too." I looked at my forearm. The tattoo was on the inside of my left forearm. The 3rd Special Forces Group insignia combined with a small scroll beneath the Deo Presso Liber motto that read, Kandahar 2019. It was not a public design. It was not something you could find in a flashbook at a tattoo shop. It existed on the arms of a specific group of people who had been in a specific place in a specific year, and who had decided to mark that fact in a specific way. The group was not large. I looked at the girl. She had brown eyes and the specific focused quality of a child who examined things carefully before she spoke about them. She was wearing a red shirt and had a small backpack shaped like a turtle, and she was looking at my forearm with the recognition of someone who had seen this image before and who was connecting the image on my arm to the image in her memory. I said, "What?" She said, "That picture, on your arm, my mom had it in the same place. I had been in ambushes. I had been in extractions under fire. I had been in rooms where the information arriving was incomplete and the margin for error was 0, and I had processed all of it and acted. I had never frozen. I froze. Not visibly. I did not go rigid or lose composure in a way the child could see." Maya was at the next exhibit, 6 years old, pressing buttons on an interactive weather display with the focused enthusiasm of a child who had decided all buttons were worth pressing until proven otherwise. The museum was a Saturday morning museum, full of the specific contained energy of children and the specific patient energy of the parents orbiting them. The frieze was interior, because there was only one way this child's mother could have that tattoo in that configuration. Her mother had been there, in Kandahar, in 2019, with me. A man appeared at the girl's shoulder, 30s, dark hair, the specific quality of a parent who had been watching his child approach a stranger with the calibrated alertness of someone who was ready to intervene if needed and who was reading the situation as he arrived. He said, "Ivy, what are you—" He saw my forearm. He stopped. He looked at me. I said, "I served with the 3rd Group, Kandahar, 2019. His face changed. He said, "Claire's unit?" I said, "Claire Solis." He said, "Yes." I said, "What happened to her?" He looked at me for a moment with the specific look of a man who had answered this question many times and for whom the answering had not become easier with repetition. He said, "She died, August 2022. Deployment to the Horn of Africa. Vehicle accident." The Children's Museum was around us. The buttons and the exhibits and the Saturday energy and Maya pressing buttons and Ivy watching me with her brown eyes and the recognition already in her face, the recognition she had placed there before either of us was ready for it. I said, "I didn't know." He said, "I know. How would you?" I want to tell you who I was before the museum and before Kandahar and before all of it, because the specific man who froze in a children's museum in Wilmington was built from things that happened a long time before that Saturday morning, and you need to understand the building to understand the frieze. I grew up in Fayetteville, North Carolina, the specific town adjacent to Fort Bragg, which was the home of the 82nd Airborne Division and Special Forces Command, and which had the specific quality of a place that had been shaped by decades of proximity to military service. Not a military family myself, my father was a contractor, my mother Carol worked in school administration, but the town had a quality that I absorbed without knowing I was absorbing it, which was the understanding that certain kinds of service were serious and that the people who chose them were worth knowing. I enlisted at 22, after graduating from NC State with a degree in mechanical engineering. I had enlisted after graduating and had spent the following 4 years working towards Special Forces, which was the specific goal I had set for myself without entirely knowing why it was the goal until I was in the middle of working toward it. Special Forces selection was the hardest thing I had done up to that point in my life. Not the hardest physical thing. The physical difficulty was real, but it was not the thing that made it hard. What made it hard was the specific sustained demand to perform correctly under conditions that were designed to prevent correct performance. You could not perform your way through Special Forces selection on natural ability. You had to know what you were doing and why you were doing it, and keep knowing when everything around you was designed to make the knowing impossible. I passed. I became an 18B, Special Forces Weapons Sergeant. I spent the following 12 years in the specific compressed reality of small unit special operations. 4 deployments to Afghanistan, 1 to Mali, 1 to the Philippines, training rotations in 8 countries. In 2016, I was on a deployment to Afghanistan. Nangarhar Province, a different rotation from Kandahar, a different team configuration, and 2 members of my team were killed in an ambush on a road outside Jalalabad. Their names were Matt Kowalski and Danny Reyes. Matt was 31. Danny was 28. I was 30 years old and I was the team's weapons sergeant, and I was in the lead vehicle when the IED detonated, and I survived because the geometry of the explosion had directed its force to the left of the vehicle rather than through the center, and Matt and Danny had been on the left and I had been on the right. Geometry. I had been to Matt's funeral in Pittsburgh. I had been to Danny's funeral in San Antonio. I had stood at both funerals with the specific contained quality of a man who had decided the grief was his to carry and who did not want to transfer the weight to anyone who had not agreed to hold it. I had carried it for 9 years. Not dramatically, not in the way of someone who was destroyed by it, in the way of someone who had found the specific pocket in himself where the carrying happened and who had put it there and who visited it sometimes when the visiting was required and who otherwise got on with the living, which was what Matt and Danny would have required of him and which he understood as clearly as he understood anything. Abby had known about the carrying. She had not tried to relieve me of it. She had been too intelligent for that, and too honest about what grief was and what it asked of the people who held it. She had simply been present alongside it, which was the only thing that actually helped. Abby died in April 2021 from sudden arrhythmic death syndrome, a rare condition in which the heart stops without warning, without structural disease, in someone who appeared completely healthy. She was 31 years old. Maya was 3. I had moved to Wilmington after leaving the Army in 2020 because Wilmington was not Fayetteville and not a military town, and I had needed a place that did not remind me of everything the Army was and that I was no longer. I had found work in private security consulting, the specific skill transfer that many Special Forces veterans made, applying the training and the experience to a civilian context that valued it. It was sufficient. It was mine. Maya was 6 years old and she was pressing buttons at the Wilmington Children's Museum on a Saturday morning in March 2025, and a 5-year-old named Ivy Solis had just pointed at my left forearm and connected me to a woman I had not known was dead. Claire Solis had been one of the best support specialists I had worked with in 12 years of service. This was not a small statement. Special Forces support specialists, the soldiers who handled logistics, communications, and the operational infrastructure that made the combat elements function, were the specific foundation of everything the A-Team did in the field, and the quality of that support determined, as much as any other factor, whether people came home. Claire had been attached to our rotation in Kandahar from February to October 2019. 8 months. She had been 28 years old. She had been married to Daniel the previous year. She had given birth to Ivy in January 2019, a month before the deployment began. She had gone to Kandahar when Ivy was 1 month old. I had known she had a new baby. She had shown the team a photograph the first week. A phone screen photograph. The specific, tired, radiant quality of a first photograph of a first child. The baby in a hospital blanket. Claire beside it with the expression of someone who had just understood something fundamental about herself. She had told the team the baby's name was Ivy. She had said it the way you said something you had been keeping close and were now allowing to be known. I had said it was a good name. She had said thank you. That had been the extent of our personal conversation in 8 months. We were not close in the way of people who had sought each other out. We were close in the way of people who had spent 8 months in a demanding and dangerous place and who had trusted each other's competence and reliability and who had understood, without discussing it, that the trust was a form of care even when it did not look like care. I had come home from Kandahar in October 2019. I had separated from the Army in 2020. I had not maintained contact with the unit after separation. The specific difficulty of military friendships when the structure that made them possible was gone. The way the connections that formed in service required the service to sustain them and often did not survive the transition. I had not known she deployed again. I had not known she went to the Horn of Africa. I had not known she died. I had not known about Ivy beyond the phone screen photograph in February 2019 when Ivy was 1 month old and I had said it was a good name. Daniel Solis was an electrical engineer. He was 40 years old and he had the quality of someone who had been managing a significant difficulty for 2.5 years and who had found, in the managing of it, a specific competence that was not comfort but was functional. We sat on a bench outside the dinosaur exhibit while Maya and Ivy looked at a Brachiosaurus skeleton with the specific reverence that children brought to things that were very large and very old. He told me about Claire. She had redeployed to the Horn of Africa in the spring of 2022, a training mission, advising local security forces, the specific work that Special Forces support elements did in the long-term engagement operations that did not make the news. She had been in a convoy on a road outside Djibouti City when the lead vehicle had rolled on a curve. Claire's vehicle had been second in the convoy and had been struck by the rolling lead vehicle. She had died from her injuries at a field hospital 6 hours later. She was 31 years old. Ivy was 3. I listened to this with the specific quality of attention I had developed in 12 years of service. Complete, not reactive, taking in everything before responding to anything. When he finished, I said, "She was the best support specialist I worked with." He said, "She was good at everything she decided to be good at." I said, "Yes, that was the quality." He said, "She talked about Kandahar. She didn't talk about it much. She knew there were things she couldn't talk about and she respected that. But when she did talk about it, she said the people were good." I looked at the Brachiosaurus skeleton. Maya had found Ivy, and they were standing side by side now, 2 girls at a skeleton, with the specific quality of children who had found each other in a large room and decided to look at the same thing. He said, "I showed Ivy her mother's photographs, the service ones. She knows about the deployments, in the way a 5-year-old knows things, which is in pieces. She knows Claire went to Afghanistan. She knows she went to Africa. She knows the tattoo." I said, "She recognized it immediately." He said, "She traces it on the photographs, the one on Claire's forearm." He paused. "Claire got it when she came back from Kandahar. She said it was for the people she was with." I thought about Claire in October 2019, coming home from 8 months in Kandahar, going to a tattoo shop and getting the 3rd group insignia with the Kandahar scroll on her left forearm. I thought about what that meant, the specific decision to mark the place and the people on your body because you wanted to carry it correctly. I said, "I got mine the same week I got home." He said, "I know. She told me everyone did." We sat on the bench outside the dinosaur exhibit for a while without saying anything. Around us, the museum was being a Saturday museum. The buttons and the exhibits and the children and the parents and the specific contained joy of a place designed for the uncomplicated investigation of the world. He said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I didn't know." He said, "I know." I said, "I should have." He said, "No, you couldn't have known. You were out. You moved on. That's what you were supposed to do." I looked at him. He said, "She wouldn't have wanted you to feel like you should have known. She didn't keep in touch with many people from the unit either. She said the transition was something you did cleanly, or it swallowed you." I said, "She was right about that." He said, "She was right about a lot of things." I drove home with Maya at noon. She was in the back seat with a museum pamphlet, the specific souvenir of a museum visit for a 6-year-old, a thing you could hold and fold and look at again, and that meant you had been somewhere and that the somewhere had been real. After a while, she said, "Dad." I said, "Yeah." She said, "That girl's name was Ivy." I said, "Yes." She said, "Her mom died?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Like mine?" I said, "Yes, like yours." She thought about this. She folded the museum pamphlet. She said, "Did you know her mom?" I said, "Yes, a long time ago, before you were born." She said, "Was she nice?" I thought about Claire in the first week, the phone screen photograph, the baby, the tired, radiant quality of someone who had just become a parent and who had carried that new thing to Afghanistan with her because there was nowhere else to put it. I said, "She was one of the best people I worked with. She was serious about the right things, and she was good at everything she decided to be good at. Maya considered this. She said, "Like you." I said, "I'd like to think so." She said, "Will we see them again? Ivy and her dad?" I said, "I think so. Yes." She said, "Good." She went back to the museum pamphlet. I drove through Wilmington in the specific quality of a March afternoon that was doing what March afternoons did in coastal North Carolina. Warm enough to feel like something was coming, but not yet committed to what the coming would be. I thought about Matt Kowalski and Danny Reyes. I thought about Claire Solis. I'd been carrying 3 people for 9 years. 3 names in the specific pocket where the carrying happened. The pocket I visited sometimes and otherwise kept closed. There were now 4. Not the same way. Claire was not the same as Matt and Danny. The grief was not the same. The circumstances were not the same. But she was there. She had been there for 2.5 years without my knowing it, which was the specific quality of grief that arrived late. Not raw, not immediate, but present. I thought about Ivy's finger on my forearm. I thought about what the tattoo was for. Claire had known what it was for. She had said it was for the people she was with. She had gotten it the week she came home from Kandahar because she had understood, at 28 years old, that marking the place and the people on your body was a way of carrying them that did not require the carrying to be visible. She had. The tattoo had carried her to me. We met again 3 weeks later. Not by accident. Daniel had given me his number at the museum and I had called him the following Tuesday. The specific call of someone who has decided that not making the call is a choice they are not willing to make. We met at a park near the waterfront. Daniel and Ivy, Ben, and Maya. A Saturday afternoon. The park doing what Wilmington parks did in late March, beginning to commit to the spring it had been suggesting. Maya and Ivy had found each other again with the specific ease of children who had decided at the dinosaur exhibit that the other person was acceptable company and who saw no reason to revise this assessment. They went to the swings. Daniel and I sat on a bench. He said, "How are you doing with it?" I said, "Still processing. It's a strange kind of grief, finding out about someone 2.5 years after the fact." He said, "I know. A lot of her unit didn't find out until months later. The Army notifies next of kin. It doesn't always make sure everyone who knew someone knows." I said, "Yes." He said, "She would have wanted you to know. She talked about Kandahar people as people who understood what the work was. Not everyone does." I said, "No." He said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I will be." He said, "That's the right answer." We watched the girls on the swings. Ivy was pumping her legs with the focused determination of a 5-year-old who had decided to go higher than she was currently going. Maya was beside her doing the same thing, and they were competing in the specific unspoken way of children who were both pretending not to compete. I said, "I want to tell Ivy something about her mother, if that's okay with you." Daniel looked at me. I said, "Something specific. From Kandahar. Something only someone who was there would know." He said, "Tell me first." I said, "The first week we were in Kandahar, February 2019, there was a communications issue. The satellite uplink for the tactical radio system went down in the middle of the night, and we had a patrol scheduled for first light. Standard protocol was to delay until comms were restored. Claire fixed the uplink herself. Not by the book, by knowing the system well enough to do something with it that wasn't in the manual. She had it running in 45 minutes. I paused. I said, "I asked her how she knew to do that. She said she'd broken the same system once in training and had spent a week figuring out how to fix it so she'd never be in that situation again. She said, if you broke something and paid attention to how you broke it, you'd know how to fix it." Daniel looked at the girls on the swings. He said, "That's Claire." I said, "Yes." He said, "Tell her." I called Ivy over from the swings. She came at a run. The specific run of a 5-year-old who had been on the swings and was now being asked to stop, which required the specific efficient transition of children who could shift their full attention from one thing to another without friction. She stood in front of me. She said, "What?" I said, "I want to tell you something about your mom." She went still. The 5-year-old energy, which was considerable, went somewhere internal. She was watching me with the specific focused quality she had brought to my tattoo at the museum. Complete attention, unhurried, waiting. I said, "Your mom and I worked together, a long time ago, in Afghanistan." She said, "I know, Dad told me." I said, "I want to tell you something she did, something that was exactly who she was." I told her the story. I told it simply, in the specific way you told things to 5-year-olds who were paying full attention, which was without decoration, without the adult additions that stories accumulated. The communications system, the first light patrol, the 45 minutes, what Claire had said about breaking something and paying attention to how you broke it. Ivy listened with her whole self. When I finished, she said, "She fixed it." I said, "She fixed it." She said, "Because she'd broken it before." I said, "Because she'd paid attention when she broke it, so she knew." Ivy thought about this. She said, "I break things sometimes." I said, "Everybody does." She said, "And I should pay attention." I said, "Your mom did." She looked at my forearm. She looked at the tattoo with the same recognition she had brought to it at the museum. The tracing recognition of a child who had seen this image in photographs and who understood it as a mark of the place where her mother had been. She reached out and touched it. Not tracing. Resting. The specific flat-palmed touch of a child making contact with something important. She said, "I'm glad you were there." I said, "I'm glad I was there too." She went back to the swings. Maya had waited. She had been watching from the swings with the specific patient quality she had from Abby, the quality of someone who understood that certain things required waiting, and who waited without making the waiting feel like pressure. When Ivy came back, Maya said, "What did he tell you?" Ivy said, "About my mom." Maya said, "What about her?" Ivy said, "She fixed something, in Afghanistan, because she paid attention." Maya considered this. She said, "That's a good thing to know." Ivy said, "Yes." They went back to the competition that was not a competition. I drove home with Maya as the March afternoon moved toward evening. She was quieter than the drive home from the museum. Not troubled, thoughtful. The specific quality of a child who had been in the presence of something and who was deciding what to do with it. She said, "Dad." I said, "Yeah." She said, "Do you have other people from when you were in the Army that you think about?" I looked at the road. I said, "Yes." She said, "Good people?" I said, "The best." She said, "Do you think about them a lot?" I said, "Sometimes, when the thinking is right." She said, "Is it sad?" I thought about this for a moment. I thought about Matt and Danny. I thought about Claire. I thought about the specific pocket where the carrying happened and what it felt like to go there. I said, "It's both things at once. Sad and something else, something that feels like they're still here because I remember them. The remembering keeps them here." Maya was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Like Mom." I said, "Yes, exactly like Mom." She said, "I remember her." I said, "I know." She said, "Her hands. She had soft hands." I said, "Yes, she did." She said, "And she smelled like that soap, the green one." I said, "Eucalyptus." She said, "Eucalyptus." She said the word carefully, the way 6-year-olds said words they had just added to their understanding. "I'm going to keep remembering." I said, "Yes, keep remembering." She said, "And Ivy will keep remembering her mom." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you'll help." I looked at the road. The Wilmington evening was arriving the way coastal evenings arrived, the light changing its quality over the water, the specific late-day softening of a city that was near enough to the ocean to feel the ocean in everything. I said, "Yes, I'll help." She went back to the museum pamphlet. I drove through the evening. I thought about what I was carrying and what I had always been carrying and what the carrying was for. Matt and Danny. Claire, the people you did not lose because you remembered them. The remembering as the form of presence that survived everything else. Ivy's hand on my forearm. The tattoo was for the people you were with. Claire had known this. She had gotten the tattoo the week she came home from Kandahar because she had understood, at 28 years old, that marking the place and the people on your body was a way of carrying them that did not require the carrying to be visible. She said the people were good. She had been right. I had been one of the people. I was still one of the people. The carrying continued. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Is there someone you have been carrying? Someone you lost, someone who shaped you, someone whose absence you feel in the specific way that real absences are felt, who you have not told anyone about. Sometimes the most important things we carry are the ones we carry alone. You don't have to carry them alone. Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. If this story stayed with you today, share it with one person who needs to hear it. You already know who that is. And if you're new here, subscribe. Every week, a story like this one. Real people, real decisions, the kind that stay with you.